Well, welcome everybody to this discussion. This is part of our series on policing at Unionist Voice this week, and what we're trying to do is have a number of discussions and a number of platform articles from all different viewpoints in relation to policing, from the disbandment of the RUC to the PSNI. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on the loyalist community, and we want to hear from people who were instrumental in the negotiations which led to the RUC becoming the PSNI, and also who were experienced in the RUC during the conflict in Northern Ireland. So very happy today to have Councillor Billy Hutchinson, the leader of the Progressive Unionist Party, with us. Billy is a former loyalist life sentence prisoner, community activist when he came out of prison, then involved in the talks for the loyalists as part of the Progressive Unionist Party delegation, then an elected representative as an MLA and councillor, and has continued over the last 20 years to interface with the police on key issues such as parading flags, flag protest, and other disputes. So you're very welcome, Billy. Thanks for taking the time to have the discussion. I suppose if I just start, Billy, by asking you, if we go back to the start, obviously you have a long history in loyalism through the 70s and 80s, and somebody from my generation who didn't live through that. Could you just give me a bit of an overview? I mean, what was loyalism's relationship actually like with the RUC in the 70s, 80s, 90s?
Well, I suppose in the 70s and 80s and even in the 90s, the difficulty was there was a very a bad relationship, one with tension, because, you know, what they were doing was they were recruiting paramilitaries to be informers, and, you know, and many of them paid to give information, and people were killed because of this and other things. And and there was a shoot to kill policy by the RUC at that particular time, and the RUC, you know, did shoot loyalists as well. But there's this whole notion, you know, that there was collusion between the RUC and loyalists. I mean, I always say that, you know, it's like anything. I mean, you'll get visitors who's looking onto their car every morning when they're taking their 5-year-old to primary school. And surely that does something to somebody's, you know, psychological makeup. But, you know, so from my point of view, I don't believe there was collusion, but I do believe, like everybody else, people gathered intelligence, and it was loyalists when they were gathering intelligence. It was collusion when Republicans were doing it. It was seen as being, you know, very Machiavellian, but also, you know, like James Bond stuff, you know, and that's how they always portray it. But no, so from that point of view, it was tough. I mean, but in the 70s and 80s in particular, you know, the army were always involved, but the RUC were with them. So therefore, it just wasn't the RUC. It was with the British soldier. Now, I know many people listening to this will be law-abiding citizens and say, well, that's the way it should be. It is, but, you know, when you're a law-abiding citizen, you know, you expect whoever is supposed to be looking after the rule of law to stay within that. But again, I understand that they always didn't, and there were reasons for that. Not everybody would agree with them. You know, most people would talk about, you know, human rights was broke. I accepted that, you know, people from my background was always going to get harassment anyway, you know, and it was there. So it was very strained in that sense, because the RUC seen us as getting in the way, or the enemy as well, and it didn't treat us any different but treated provosts. And I'm not sure that story's been told, and I would hope that other loyalists could tell that story, who went through that sort of harassment. And you know, because it was more than harassment. Like, you know, people were seriously injured. People were, I suppose, in many ways, just harassed coming out their door, and harassed their neighbours as well. But British intelligence through the army were involved in that as well. So, I mean, the RUC were there as a support act, really, for the army, and to keep it civilianised. But, you know, it was a long, hard time. And then we've seen this notion of supergrass, as we've also seen RUC sort of being involved in that, and, you know, bringing people to court and getting them sentenced, and then find out later they had to let them go because the evidence wasn't what it was. And the supergrasses always weren't what they were either, you know, and so that's always a problem. And I think the problem is whenever you have a supergrass, and I haven't really, you know, looked at this, but just off the top of my head, those supergrasses did what they did. They actually protect themselves and survive. It was never to do with helping the RUC at all. It just was a byproduct, but it was about them trying to get out of a situation they were in. And they didn't work. You know, the black courts and supercrosses just don't work, and people can make up evidence, and people will be told the odd evidence in. But anyway, we're in a different period now, Jamie, and I think that, so during that whole period, there was a notion that we should actually look at how we would reform the police. And I suppose it was reforming the police from being a force into a service. And so that was the idea. Now, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, just staying with the historical bit just for a moment before we move on that. Obviously, what you've articulated there is the lived experience of loyalists who would have been, let's say, involved in the conflict and interfacing with the RUC or the army on that basis. Did you find then that there was tension or that exacerbated the differences between loyalism and mainstream political unionism? Because mainstream political unionism and middle class unionism would have always, for the most part, been very supportive of the police, maybe until Anglo-Irish Agreement, Drumcree, things like that might have strained that, but for the most part they were very supportive of the police. And do you think that helped create this kind of narrative of, an underclass of loyalism within unionism? Do you think that the policing issues played into that in the 70s, 80s, 90s to a lesser degree?
There's no doubt about it. The Ulster said the DUP wouldn't support the notion of this because they thought by supporting loyalists who were being treated in a totally different way and outside the rule of law, they were saying that reinforces what Republicans say. And there's no question about that. People were alienated. When I was a kid, police officers lived, maybe 200 yards from where I lived. Now, it wasn't the same street, but you know what I mean? And you seen them all the time. During the Troubles, that changed. Well, that was because of the amount of money that police officers were on, and it put them up in what I would call a lower middle class bracket, and they moved in the sort of, the leafy suburbs or wherever they moved to. But the two main parties at that time were mainly loyalist unions, but also supported by, the DUP. The difficulty was that they didn't want to recognise, human rights abuses, or they didn't want to recognise loyalists. So they always sort of turned away from that. I know a number of people, who were badly beaten, and whenever the Ulster unions at that particular time were approached, they just wouldn't do it. So you maybe had people with broken jaws. The human rights had completely been done. There was no evidence against them to even hold them for longer than they held them. And when those questions were put to the Ulster unions, they backed off. They didn't want to know.
No, that's really interesting. Something I've been thinking about over the last couple of years in terms of, do you think loyalism in the 70s, 80s and 90s in some respects missed the boat or missed the trick in terms of because unionism corporately, there was always this deference to law and order, respect for the police. Do you think that unionism generally, but more specific loyalism, missed out on not becoming activists legally in terms of taking all those human rights cases and using the courts more forcefully in that period?
Well, I mean, they did, and they some of them may have paid lip service, about the Supercross trials and stuff like that, but they didn't go at it. Where we would have had the SDLP and others, including Sinn Féin, really had no strength. They were complaining about what was happening. I think, Jimmy, it also sort of divided Northern Ireland into two bits, and what it did was it meant that those people who were on the Republican side were welcomed back into their communities as heroes. And I'm not suggesting that I wanted to be welcomed back into my community as a hero. All I wanted to do, to be honest, was just to go back into the community and nobody to know me other than people who did. But that didn't work out because I had to make a choice about where we were going, and I had to make a choice about whether loyalism come out and spoke or continually let big house unions speak for them and just keep a boot in their neck, because that's how I felt. These people weren't interested in what we were trying to do. They weren't interested. And Jimmy, look, let's be honest, irrespective of what people think about the peace process or the political process, these people for years and years and years done nothing. Even in 91, when loyalists called ceasefires, they still couldn't get agreement around the table. None of them tried to bring about peace. And whether we like that or whether we don't, the point about it was, we were at a point in this society, where we needed to do something. Now, and what I mean by that is that we need to stop the death toll. That was the thing that we needed to do. It was, we were just continuing, and there looked like there was no way out. So from that point of view, even from a humanity point of view, the larger party couldn't actually stand back and say, yeah, maybe this is what we need to do. Now, if that was about politics and about getting votes, I don't think that's the way you should get your votes. We all have issues, and we'll all know there's plenty of issues about it at the minute, and we need to work on them, and we need to work on them together. And if we don't, we're going to return to the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where the people who were voting for people who weren't going to make any changes to anybody's life, irrespective of whether that was social, political, or environmental. They weren't going to make those changes. So we can't afford to allow this to happen again. And I think we need to learn lessons from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I understand that people wouldn't even know what went on because, as you said, Jimmy, you weren't there in the 70s or 80s, you weren't even born. But as well as that, I think that a lot of people didn't know what was going on in their own backyard. They didn't actually see it. They were oblivious to it all. But, we don't need to go back there. But we do need political parties who are going to stand up against, wrong. And make sure that that's rated. And my view is even about the RUC or the PSNI, particularly the PSNI. And this isn't to degrade the RUC. The RUC had a very difficult job to do under attack from Republicans. And from that point of view, what I'm saying is, we need to recognise whoever it is, whether it's the PSNI, when they do good. But we also need to recognise and call them out when they do the wrong thing. And Jimmy, you've been about this for a while now, and you will understand when we maybe get to a latter bit, how the flag protest went, how we had a prime minister stand up and tell us that he would look after the Republicans while, the police would look after loyalists. I mean, that statement in its own, when you look at that and you try to analyse it, it means they politicise Republicans and they will criminalise loyalists. And they tried to do that, and they did in many ways, even people who weren't involved in any shape or form of criminality. And, we hear all the stories about people that are put out there, and sometimes I wonder who puts them out and why they're put out. And we've seen it all the time. And we've seen people who come forward in loyalism at that particular time, and we're wondering why and how did they raise to that position. And the media see them as people who have a view, and that view would tend to be one that actually is negative about loyalism. So what I'm saying to you is, loyalism has a lot to offer, and loyalism offered quite a bit. And my point of view is that, and you're doing part of this, and that's why you have you have the social media you have, and you have this media that you have to get people to have a voice. But, we need to have more people speaking. We need to have more people writing. And it doesn't matter what background you're from. If you're from a background, of unionism or loyalism, and you feel, that you want to write about it. There's no right and wrong in this. We can all argue about it, but at the end of the day, we should be together, and we should be certainly together in terms of our culture, in terms of our Britishness, and in terms of the union.
No, I absolutely, and agree with you. And obviously, the purpose of Unionist Voice in this is to try and encourage more voices within unionism and loyalism to be confident, to speak out, and to have these debates and discussions. And the more people that can come forward and engage, the better, because we need that capacity within our communities. But before we get on to obviously you were involved in the talks, Belfast Agreement, and I mean, my views on the Belfast Agreement. You and I have argued about this over the years, but I mean, this is not what today's about. This is not an adversarial debate. I mean, this is your reflection. So I'm not going to argue the point out with you, but there was an interesting point there, which just digress a little minute. And you said about giving peace a chance and humanitarian, and just while we're on that subject, in 1998, do you think that loyalism's approach was more focused on basically peace had to be given a chance, and a humanitarian approach to giving peace a chance, rather than actually the minutiae of the agreement? And actually, is it the case that loyalists signed up to give peace a chance without necessarily, being entirely sure how the agreement itself would work out? And it's transpired that the agreement has not worked out well for unionism. Or what's your reflections on that now? I mean, what was the motivation? Was it primarily humanitarian?
Well, Jimmy, it was a mixture of things. Like, we had talked to many people around the world who were involved in conflict, and, we had an idea what we were going to do before we moved into this. into any talks. We had agreements with Irish America. We had, they held up because Irish America stopped funding the IRA at that particular time. And I'm talking about the key players, the billionaires actually started to put their money in the integrated schools and cross community stuff rather than the IRA. That was a big blow for the IRA, because they lost quite a lot of money in it. But we were ourselves in UDP were actually trying to work this out. We also had people in Dublin who we were talking to, and we were given guarantees that this wasn't about United Ireland. It was about acting as guarantors for those nationalists who lived in Northern Ireland. And to protect them from being discriminated against or whatever, and we accepted that. But what we got, Jamie, was that before we got out the door, we had Blair, talking about statements that was never talked about in the talks, and I remember Molly coming up to me and saying that Blair had give Trimble a letter. And it's just not worth the paper it was written on. There was no discussion around this. It wasn't agreed. And that's what we had, Jamie. So from my point of view, I'm not, it isn't perfect. It didn't end up perfect. But my difficulty was, it was the personalities who were involved in it changed things to make it imperfect. And if you remember, I say this all the time, the Ulster Unionists talked about no guns, no government. They hoisted themselves their own petard because they wanted to be in government, so the difficulty of that was nobody thought Sinn Féin were going to be the largest party, but they were, and I suppose the Hugh Maddens thing set all that up for them. But the reality here is, that people in the background in the British government and possibly in some of the security services, at Whitehall or wherever, done this. And they messed it up. It doesn't even look like what it should have looked like. And so from that point of view, I think, what I'm saying to you is we went into this thinking we were in the right place at the right time, and then people withdrew. So, for instance, the obvious one is that Sinn Féin signed up to the agreement. They signed up to the principal consent. And now they're telling us that they used it as a stepping stone for United Ireland. And now we have Europe and America, and I'm not sure whether the Conservatives are behind this or not, but they're, they need to waken up. These people saying, it reminds me of 1921 all over again, and I wasn't here in 1921. I know I look old, but I wasn't here. The point I'm making, Jimmy, is that there were so many external things that were done after that it destroyed the whole thing. So I'd be the first to admit, now, looking back on it, in hindsight's a wonderful thing. I wouldn't have done it again.
I was just, would you do it again? And look, I think that's a really fair and honest assessment of it. And as you know, you and I have argued and thought about this many times over the years. I'm sure we will do in the future as well. But I think to your credit, there's two sides to this. People like myself look at the agreement from a purely legal, political, policy viewpoint and see the outworkings of it, and it's bad for unionism in my view on that. But by the same token, what you've articulated today, there was different pressures at the time, there was different considerations, there was humanitarian considerations, and understanding all of that is important for the discussions going forward, and for everybody to have an understanding. So on the policing bit around that time, what policing, how did that come into the talks? What was the loyalist view of policing reform in the talks? What was the loyalist position on that?
Well, our position was quite simple. We thought in a new Northern Ireland, what we needed was a policing service. The second thing that we argued and didn't get anywhere with it was that we didn't believe in two things. One is that you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. In other words, there's lots of experience in the RUC and you don't get rid of them. And then the other thing was that we argued was that any policing board should be apolitical. We didn't get there. There's political people on the board. I'll just use this as an example. So if you remember, Arlene Foster called for the Chief Constable's resignation. And there were riots in the Shankill shortly after. And I spoke to a number of women who took their children away from her to make sure they weren't involved in riots, and said, why did she not just sack them? And I went, she has no responsibility over them. The Assembly don't employ, any of the chief constables. So there's a difficulty in our society that we haven't even explained how all this works. And what I don't want to do is I don't want to decry those people who were put on it who were not political, because they seem to be the ones, in my opinion, Jimmy, who have actually made moves and try to change things and try to get the police to do it in a different way. But I don't remember, and I could be wrong, but I don't remember any of the political raps on it doing anything on our side. I do remember people on the Republican side who were breaking the law and weren't even getting charged. And and the point of that is you can't sit in the policing board and break the law.
Yeah.
That's the whole point.
Do you think then, Billy, I suppose over the last 20 years of the PSNI, and obviously I've been around 10 or 15 of those years, you've been around at the forefront for 2 decades and more in terms of the PSNI. Do you find that the PSNI, because they were set up with this, the political objective, if we're honest about the police, was win nationalist support? Do you feel that the narrative of the police will deal with loyalists, as you touched on, and the government will deal with the Republicans, has played into policing, whereby there has been two-tier policing over the last 2 decades, and there has been an attempt to criminalise loyalism, sometimes unfairly?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's sometimes. I think it was for quite a while. I can remember being asked to go to a meeting in Portrush with the police, and it was about how do we police loyalist areas. And I said, well, we told you at the start not to have a love them with Sinn Féin. The reality here is what you need to get your officers to do is to work on the ground and show how that changes. But you didn't. You just had a love in. What you wanted to do was to put your arms around Republican communities or nationalist communities and make them think it is great. But at the end of the day, and I say this 100 times, if you're policing in a divided society, then you need to make sure that you do it on an even hand. And they didn't. So what they did was they went out at the very start and they were only interested in Republican communities. And the problem with that was they went out so hard to actually get them involved. The other thing is, I believe, that they were trying to shore up Sinn Féin. Because Sinn Féin was saying, we should talk to the police, we should do this, we should do that. And other people who, I suppose, were disaffected from Sinn Féin in terms of republicanism and thought that it shouldn't be done this way, it should be done another way. So moved in and they did it. We know that when Sinn Féin have a project, they do it until they get it done. They don't stop. And that's what they did with policing. So we can't see right up to the present day what happened. So when all of that was going on, loyalists were being harassed and harangued over silly things, and many loyalists and communities couldn't move about because they were waiting on them outside, outside their wherever they lived, and then they were harassing them. And, they pushed people in the wrong way. And from that point of view, then they had to build that relationship back up with loyalism. And they tried to do that. And, I just think at the very beginning, they lost the plot in terms of what are we supposed to be doing here? And, somebody eventually, the light went on their head and said, okay, this is what we need to do. So, Jamie, around the flag protest, we had been working around restorative justice because we didn't want young people getting criminal records, so we were saying we could use restorative stuff. And, it worked for a while. Then we were meeting the police at that time in Knock every Thursday to make sure that we could, stop them from doing what they were doing, saying, don't be handling like this, you're doing it wrong. Here's what you should have done, and you've done this.
Blocked the bridge that Saturday.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, exactly. And the difficulty was, they were listening to us. But I have to say that this particular Thursday, it all changed. We walked into Knock, and on their way out was 2 political parties. And the attitude in that room and the atmosphere, everything changed. They weren't interested in listening to us. They were taking a hard line. And our view was, you take a hard line and you'll see what you're going to end up with, because nobody is going to allow you to take that hard line. It says all you're going to do is drive these communities into the corner, and these communities will then be trapped and they'll have to come out fighting. And we warned them about it. We wouldn't listen. we had somebody with us who actually was in Iraq and Afghanistan and had done tours, and he come around and he talked about star jumps and everything else that they were doing, and they didn't have the security rate on the day that you were talking about. We told them all that. They didn't listen. And he was saying that this guy was quite good. And this guy just turned around and said he was working as a security expert, you know what I mean, in other countries. And we got him to come to meet with us and try to tell them what they needed to do. And they just didn't listen to him. Now, this is a guy of 20 years experience in the army. And they weren't listening. He stood with me in the city centre, and we watched it when they pushed people towards the markets and Short Strong, when they should have took them the other way.
And they caused that?
Yeah, no, they did. That's the point they're making too. And they didn't listen. They were getting security advice from an independent person who they could not have actually had a mark against, because this guy got into wherever he wanted to get in, and he was used, in foreign places by both the British and by the Americans. Didn't listen. Yeah. And that's the difficulty, Jimmy. They didn't listen because they'd already been told by two other political parties, put this down.
And I suppose then, just coming to an end of this, Billy, in terms of going forward, where we are now, I mean, I don't think it's unfair to say that there's more than a perception now. There's a strongly held belief in loyalist communities that there is two-tier policing, and the PSNI are biased against loyalist communities. How do you think the police can fix that, or can go about starting to repair those relationships in loyalist communities, if at all possible?
Well, Jimmy, I think that the PSNI, and I could be wrong, this is my perception, that they didn't change. The whole point about it was they're still doing political policing. They still have their £10 touts or £20 touts. I don't know what they want them for, because, what do they want them for? But the point I'm saying to you here, they need to change that attitude. The second thing they need to do is that they need to be working with our young people in loyalist communities to try to recruit them to come into, and I'm talking about properly here, and I'm talking about being touts, I'm talking about being officers at some level. They also need to change the attitude about moving people because they become native. Because you can get good officers who know what needs to be done, and they don't like that. What they like to do is to have people who will do what they're told rather than actually working their initiative. Lots of things need to change. Now, we know that they're going into a recruitment drive here, and I think that I'd like to see that in our schools. And I'm not talking about our grammar schools. I'm talking about working class kids. They need to be going in and talking to them and seeing what can be done and how they can actually get them in. We are not going to do anything, Jimmy, if we can't get these people into the PSNI, because they don't live in our communities, they don't understand, and they have an opinion of us. And I have to be honest, it's by the Sunday rags that's where they get their opinion from. And as you know as well as I do, the Sunday rags are never right, because they listen again to somebody who gets 50 quid for a story. And, stories aren't always the truth. The point about it is, you need to be in our communities and react. And yes, we have problems in our communities, and we need to resolve them, Jimmy. We all need to do that together, but it has to be the community together to resolve the issues we have. So that's not whitewash over this. But, my view is, I'd also say to people, we need to have the rule of law upheld in our communities. And, I have a 20-year-old daughter. She lives in London. She's at university as well. But, from my point of view, what do you do if my daughter's raped? You know what I mean? We need to have our people protected. Or if somebody's son is badly beaten or whatever, we need to have a police service that is actually going to do something about all of this and try to help. And we need to do it as a community as well. So we need to hold our hands up and say, yeah, we're not happy with the PSN do, but if they do something good, Jimmy, then we need to go out and say, well, that was well done. And the next time you do something wrong, we'll be out to criticise you again. But certainly, I think that we need to be arguing that we need to have some sort of relationship with the PSNI in our community, and they should be talking to everybody and anybody they can get to talk to. But they need to actually take that away and say, right, this is what we're going to do. My view is, if they have a recruitment drive here, we need to be arguing, Jimmy. We want you to come in the loyalist schools, inner city schools, or wherever in rural areas, and actually talk to people and recognise that there are young people there who might have an opportunity to do something. We don't need somebody with a degree who's went to Queen's to become a policeman. We maybe need them to be forensic people, or we maybe need them to be chief inspectors or chief constables. But at the minute, we need people on the ground who know what they can do and know their communities and actually work in them.
Do you think, just finally, Billy, and after the Black Lives Matter protest, and there was this issue of police misunderstanding or not understanding those particular communities, and they developed an engagement program and project so as they could understand those communities. Do you think something like that, in terms of a loyalist engagement from the police, to try and understand and to actually go beyond, and I include myself in this, go beyond gatekeepers, as it were, go beyond the usual faces, and actually go into our communities and talk and meet and engage with people and get beyond the gatekeepers? Because I mean, you'll know yourself, in loyalism, it's always the same few, the same old faces. I mean, I'm of the view that the police need to go beyond that and actually go into the grassroots of these communities. Do you think that's something that we...
Jamie, it's 100%. And we had a meeting with them recently. And we had a meeting with these community engagement people who've been appointed. And we met with them and we had that conversation, Jimmy. That's what they need to do. That's what we're saying to them. We're saying to them, you need to have access in schools, you need to have access in communities, and you need to go beyond the usual suspects. Because, you know, the usual suspects aren't getting you anywhere. I'm not saying drop them, but you need to actually go and listen to other views. Now, I'm hoping, Jimmy, that happens. If it isn't happening, then we need to be talking about it. And we need to be saying, right, okay, get these people out and talk to the people they need to be talking to. But there's no question about it, Jimmy. That's what needs to happen. But I will say to you, Jimmy, and I suppose, you know, we need to get our community to understand human rights. We need to get them to understand that we need to challenge in this, because for too long, loyalism's walked away from it. You know, the issue is, you know, human rights can be taken to the highest court in the land, and that's what we need to be doing. There's so many of it, and you will know as well as I do, lots of people during the flag protests were intimidated. They were threatened about not being, and they did this through Facebook, because they found out where people were going on holiday, and if they were going to people or places like America, they were saying, "Oh, you'll not go back in America again. We'll give you a criminal record and you'll not get a visa." Now, you know, the difficulty with this is they're the things that we need to be fighting. You know, and if the PSNI is doing that sort of stuff, that's challenging. You know, there's no point in going to someone in the policing board who's elected. They won't do anything. We'd be better talking to the independents and getting them to do something about it. But what I'm saying here is unionism needs to be united in this, Jimmy. It shouldn't be one member or one person going. We all need to lend it. Now, you know, obviously certain people have to go and talk to them. So what I'm saying is that in future when these things are happening, if everybody's not going to be in the room, then people need to actually sign a petition or saying something to say that the people that are here are representing the views, and here's the views that we have. You know, we need to strengthen all of this. You know, and people need to walk away from this notion, you know, that we're mimicking Republicans. We aren't. You know, we have rights, and we need to make sure that they're enforced. We need to hold the PSNI to account, and we need to make sure, you know, that they're not breaching the notion, you know, of breaking the law themselves. They actually get somewhere. All of that's in the past. It shouldn't be happening. So what I'm saying is there's lots of things loyalism need to do, but if we're not united as unionism, we're not talking about political parties here, I'm talking about unionism needs to unite. And if we don't, we'll get nowhere. Everybody keeps telling us, and I don't believe it's right, but they keep telling us, oh, there's not one voice. But we need to create a voice that represents everybody. That doesn't mean to say, Jimmy, that if you were going and I didn't disagree with everything you're saying, I'm going to walk away from it. Of course not. I mean, it's like a political party. You know, I don't think there's a political party in the UK that I would agree with every policy, but that isn't the issue. It is, do you believe in the majority of them? So from my point of view, yes. And the work that you are doing, I think it's fantastic. And we need to keep doing it. But we need to give a voice to those people who don't have one at the minute. And there's quite a lot of unions who don't have a voice.
Look, Billy, thank you very much for your time. We've had a good 35 minutes, a really good discussion there. We could go on all day, and I'm sure the people who'll be watching this will very much appreciate it and get a lot of it out of it. So just thank you very much, Billy, and I appreciate your time, and I hope we can have more.
Jimmy, I have to say that if this was an Olympic sport, I think me and you'd be gold medalists. In terms of We may not always say the right things, or we may not, people mightn't agree with us, but the one thing we could do, we could talk, you know, and I think both of us would be British gold medalists if it was for talking.
No problem. Ollie, thanks very much.